And so today I want to sort of do a little bit of a recap of what we've learned and how hopefully we can help. Just before jumping into the topic, I think over the last couple of days we heard quite a bit about the value of open source from an economic and social standpoint. I'm assuming many of you have seen this 2021, I would say, landmark study from the Commission showing how much open source actually contributes to the EU GDP, and it's estimated to be, again, this was 3 years ago, so I would say this is a conservative estimate as far as today, if you sort of plot it towards today, between 65 to 95 billion. So I think that is kind of a given in all the conversations, especially within the open source community and increasingly at policymaker level, there is a clear understanding of the value of open source, or at least a clear estimation. But over the last, 3 years, and particularly in the last 6 months, 9 months, obviously, the geopolitical climate evolutions sort of have pushed the conversation of digital sovereignty and how open source can be a key pillar for achieving that sort of to the forefront. Earlier in the week, you might have heard we released our annual open source report on Europe. It's pretty clear that the industry experts and leaders see open source as a concrete pillar for that. I'm quoting also a report from Wire earlier in the year, which again puts open source for its transparency, for the sort of vendor lock-in prevention, and so many other sort of inherent qualities of open source as the key for achieving digital autonomy. And despite this guy, it's not necessarily European. As the AI race accelerates, we are seeing open source being used, to shift, or at least attempt to shift or influence geopolitical balances. I would say, especially in the last 6 months, and this is both sort of when I work with my FINOS hat on and have conversations with financial institutions, as well as I come here in Europe, sort of after the DeepSeek moment, it's been a very different level of conversations when it comes to how open source can shift market balances or shift geopolitical balances. I mean, it is very interesting to see how OpenAI, just a couple of weeks ago, or felt like it was the right way forward to open source some of their models, or at least put it open weight. Again, I'm not going to go into that debate right now. And if you ask the president of Europe, well, I don't know if you guys have seen, there's been a funny quote out there of Trump calling himself the president of Europe, or at least saying that the EU leaders call him like that. Again, this is not just a EU thing. It has been recognized that open source can truly shift the balance of sort of where technology and innovation happens. It seems to me that when I look at the different sort of data points in terms of research, articles out there, there still seems to be, though, a gap between the vision of, yes, open source is a great pillar of digital sovereignty, and actual execution and actual progress. Again, quoting those 2 reports, both our report, the State of Digital Sovereignty report, they're clearly, again, while there's optimism around open source, there are sort of doubts about how ambitious or how optimistic folks are that we will be able to achieve, a progressive, quick plan towards European digital autonomy. As we were preparing with the team, So an article from actually the CEO of SAP on sort of a critique, I would say, on the current approach to digital sovereignty out there. And while it's not necessarily related per se to the open source part of it, it is interesting that the executive of the largest European tech company has concerns as to the progress towards this very valuable goal. And so I'm encouraged to see, obviously, so many initiatives out there. I don't know if you guys are familiar with any of this, but there are at least 3, 4 initiatives out there that put open source front and center, I would say, of the digital sovereignty conversation. The IPSI-CIS is a project that we have been tracking for a while. You might have seen our announcement around NeoNephos earlier in the year. But again, I think the good news is that there are multiple separate initiatives, again, funding and putting forward the vision that open source should be at the core of digital sovereignty plans for Europe. But it also creates fragmentation. From the standpoint of the open source communities, it is really hard to follow these different, in some cases, massive and highly sort of complex and bureaucratic initiatives. And so I think when I look, again, at the landscape, sort of fragmentation of the initiatives and sort of the need for consolidation, it's certainly the first thing that stands out. More recently, there's been calls, really, for buying European. If you look at those 4 initiatives, or at least a couple of those, it's not just about open source from a technical standpoint, but how the public sector procures software. And I think clearly this is an important aspect. But it's easy, I would say, to fall into the temptation to say buy European means we need to have European open source. I think there's no such concept as European open source, American open source, or Chinese open source. Open source is effectively the last, or one of the last ways that we are globally collaborating. And so, whilst it's not just sort of a principle here in my mind, if you think about, if you look at some data points, as Europe, wants to really play an important role, especially again as the AI race accelerates, it will just simply be unsustainable to create a European version of open source, or maintain or rebuild. The study from 2024 from Harvard Business School, it estimates sort of the rebuild cost of open source out there to over 4.1 billion. And I don't think there's, frankly, time or resources to do so. That's a static picture of sort of the value of open source last year. But if you think on an ongoing basis, we talked over the previous days, obviously it all starts with individual maintainers. But corporates and organizations have certainly contributed to fueling open source to where it is right now. And they do it in a few ways. They do it through financial contributions. They do it through labor and effectively sponsoring their employees to participate in open source community, or direct to maintainers funding. So just by quoting another Harvard business study, that's the open source funding survey that was published last year. The overall contributions from organizations globally, so that includes Europe, were estimated at something around 7.7 billion a year. And so would we want to miss out on the ongoing support and innovation that comes from global organizations? It almost is like if Europe should base its sort of scientific progress on research that just comes out of the EU. In fact, I wouldn't be able to quote these Harvard studies if that was the approach. And again, I'm not going to go dwell sort of into this too much, but there's also, in my mind, very practical considerations, like what does even e-open source mean? What's the threshold? How do we sort of detangle this very highly interconnected network of components that make up architectures, sort of modern architectures? I mean, again, open source has proven to be, it works, and it works in a way that, as Jim was saying on Monday, pushes down cost and pushes up the value, the innovation we can build. And if we are to sort of break it and rationalize, regionalize it, balkanize it, I fear we're not going to see the same sort of virtuous circle. So what do we do? I think, from my perspective, having now lived also in the US for many years, I think when I build communities, whether it be in sort of banks or what I see across many of the projects of the Linux Foundation, is that we need, it's not really just about open source, but it's about creating open ecosystems on top of open source projects. And I would argue openly governed, truly openly governed ecosystems on top of open source. What do I mean by that? Well, I was going to do a whole diagram of sort of how the value chain flows in open source, but just being a little stereotypical, I figured I would talk about a pizza. And obviously the core of a successful ecosystem is projects and the communities around that. And so I would say that's flour and water. But as you probably heard in the last few days, also from our State of Commercial Open Source report, I really do think that it's key to have a vibrant sort of commercial open source ecosystem built around these open source projects. Ultimately, if you think about the public sector or large enterprises, they mostly procure software through service providers that give them support, give them reliability. I've heard so many times, where do I sign? I'm like, well, that's open source. So if you want to sign somewhere, you probably need some company building a product or a service around open source. Obviously, you got to activate yeast, and so VCs and again, public sector funding are the way to really get this open ecosystem, commercial ecosystem going on top of open source projects. I might be biased, but I've worked for so many years in vertical industries, and I think ensuring that it's not only technology companies, but the actual end users. Daniel was mentioning the automotive industry on Monday, and how many contribute back. We're able to show value and foster organic contributions, whether financial or labor from large enterprises. I think it's another critical aspect here. And then finally, this wouldn't happen without the right regulatory or the right economic framework around it. And I would argue, in many cases, for strategic projects, not every project needs to be neutrally owned, but we've seen over the last years the growth of single vendor open source projects, changing the license, ensuring sort of the long-term sustainability and neutrality of a project is really what foundations like us are about. So it also gave me the chance of testing ChatGPT skills in drawing a pizza. Doesn't look very Italian. Anyway, so how can we help? Trying to stay on time here. I mentioned we've announced the NeoNephos project earlier in the year. This is one of the first outcomes from the IPSI-CIS sort of cascade funding. It is built under LF Europe. It's not meant to build the whole stack, rather to work also with several other projects at the Linux Foundation. It was, in fact, announced at KubeCon. And so I think this is a really good model to think about focusing on European-specific collaborations while working sort of the global digital commons that we have available. And there's been a few panels. There's one later today. Make sure that you check it out. One thing that I haven't touched much on is also that when you think about supporting our projects and our communities in, complying with global regulations, that's another sort of aspect of being global. We feel like the Linux Foundation can support not only its projects, but the whole ecosystem. And so one project that I'm particularly very interested in, also with my financial services hat on, is the OpenSSF baseline. It really provides a tool to not only assess the security posture of any open source project, but really maps back to the different global regulations. And so provides, again, thinking about Daniel's Stenberg talk on Monday and the added pressure on maintainers to maintain projects, I think this is a great tool to hopefully harmonize the burden for an open source maintainer that brings that project in different regions and different regulatory regimes. When I think with my Italian hat on, what I'd love to see happen in Europe to foster the growth of this ecosystem, I mean, there are some very promising initiatives. You might have seen a couple of weeks ago the announcement for a feasibility study for the creation of an EU sovereign tech fund. Many of you, I hope, are familiar with the German sovereign tech fund, which over the last 3 years really charted the path for a nation state supporting the maintenance of critical open source dependencies, again, that are sort of critical to the sovereignty of that nation state. In sort of the spirit of consolidation that I was talking about before, I think it's really cool to see a proposal that tries to harmonize that at EU level. Ultimately, the projects that we're trying to support are the same, and so the more we can have consolidated efforts, I think it's a very positive thing and positive development. Again, I'm not going to go into policy proposals here. It's not my place. But as the EU looks at public procurement policies for software, and as the sort of EU GDP is very much, there's a large chunk that is sort of public sector driven, it's important to fully understand the value chain of open source, where we discuss the creation not just of open source projects, but the whole open ecosystem that can ensure not only that these projects go to market, but they get sustained. And so, again, quoting another Harvard Business School work from a few years ago, these are some of the metrics of studying the impact of France introducing a sort of an open source first policy in their procurement. I think, again, understanding the full extent and nature of the ecosystem is critical here in new policy proposals. Last but not least, again, those of you who've seen the keynote on day one, I really think there is a major opportunity to accelerate the commercial open source ecosystem in Europe. And this is an opportunity for VCs, for obviously founders and creators out there, open source project creators out there. Still the largest share of funding globally for commercial open source companies comes from the US. But what the study showed us with numbers is truly that commercial open source is a great business model that outperforms in sort of funding metrics proprietary alternatives, and that it does benefit the upstream project itself, both in terms of contributors, releases, which obviously sort of contributes creating this hopefully virtuous cycle. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here. And I'm sort of, you don't have to trust an Italian on that. This slide is from a French venture capital who's creating a commercial open source dedicated fund for Europe. And some of the numbers are interesting. That there's more developers, there's more opportunities, but there's much less funding, as the monetization still comes. The funding and the access still come from the US. So I think that's where the gap and the opportunity are. And last but not least, and that's I think a good segue into the rest of today's program. This is the Open Source Contributor Index. It's maintained by EPAM. When I look at the top 10 organizations contributing, this is just basic sort of GitHub metrics out there. There's no European in the top 10. There's 2 Europeans in the top 20. I will let you guess who they are. You can actually click through. I couldn't just fit them in a page. And so I think going back to part of what we should look at is ensuring that more EU companies, might not big tech, it might be industry, realize the value of open source and start truly stepping up in terms of contributing back to the community. Again, I might be biased, and you'll hear quite a bit later today. The next 2 panels are about how industries, sort of traditional industries, which are very strong in Europe, are looking at open source. We have at least 3 or 4 vertical foundations in the Linux Foundation that are helping, again, traditional industries in this journey. Who knows? Could this be the sort of block that is so strong in Europe that accelerate open source? Before I leave you, if you are interested to learn more about the findings in the sort of European report that we published earlier in the week, pull up your phone. You got a QR code here, and I'm sure you'll find something useful. I'd love to hear from you if you are able to catch me around. I'll be around the next couple of hours. So thank you.